This is the Asia Trade. I'm Shery in Seoul.
I'm Avril Hong in Singapore. Your top stories this hour. Asian markets set to open cautiously as uncertainty deepens following a U.S. court ruling that deemed President Trump's tariffs illegal. Traders also expected to be on edge amid political upheaval in Thailand and protests in Indonesia. The deadly unrest there also forcing President Prabowo Subianto to cancel a trip to China.
And I'm Stephen Engel in Tianjin as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO, gets underway with world leaders like Vladimir Putin and Narendra Modi in attendance. Xi and Modi saying they're going to rebuild ties amid the U.S. tariff war.
And this is a setup across Asia for the first trading session of September. We have seen Nikkei stocks rise in the previous week, but right now we're seeing futures gaining 0.3%. The Japanese yen last month saw gains against the U.S. dollar. Of course, we continue to watch for economic data out of Japan this week as well. We do have capex numbers in this hour, and we're also following some of those defense stocks because the defense ministry came out with a record budget for next year. We are watching Australia PMI numbers right now, rising to the highest since 2022. We also have factory output numbers out of China remaining in contraction territory. Take a look at how U.S. futures are setting up. We are headed towards a holiday on September 1st, but we saw those gains in the month of September, the fourth consecutive month of gains for the S&P 500, despite the fact that we saw a little bit of downside when it came to the Friday session with that sell-off in tech. The biggest economic data this week out of the U.S. will be those non-farm payrolls. We're expecting a print of 75,000 jobs to be added for the month of August.
Yeah, Shery, of course, geopolitics is also in the backdrop. And over the weekend, we had the Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi pledging to rebuild ties amid pressures from the U.S. trade war. And both sides met at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin on Sunday. Bloomberg's chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel is at the event and joins us now. So, Stephen, what is your sense of whether the two sides can put aside long-standing issues, disagreements over Pakistan, and rebuild ties? Or as they've been characterizing it, can the elephant and the dragon dance together?
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's what obviously the host nation, China, definitely wants. State media has been using that terminology, the dragon and elephant tango, as of course some have also described this as a bit of a gift from Washington to China as Xi Jinping hosts this SCO. It's been around since 2001, but hasn't really gained a lot of global prominence yet. But this is going to be the biggest one to date, with more than 20 world leaders. Actually, in fact, you're going to have the leaders of China, India, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, among others, all on the same stage for the first time in many years. So there is some growing clout, of course, amid the ongoing trade friction coming from Washington. And I think, you know, the China-Russia dynamic is going to build upon strength. The no-limits partnership between Xi and Putin is going to be there. Whether we're going to get any oil deals or energy deals announced, it's yet to be seen. This might not be a real newsworthy event. It's more about China sort of courting India, as you rightfully said, Avril. India is the big fish to catch right now because they're long time known for strategic autonomy. They don't really have any defense treaties signed with anybody. Yes, they're part of the Quad, along with the United States, Australia, and Japan. They're also part of BRICS and then SCO, but they don't have any security alliance inked. They like that strategic ambiguity or strategic autonomy. So that's why the full court press, if you will, the courting of Modi here is ongoing. And already Narendra Modi has announced that they're going to resume flights between the two countries, between China and India, that have been suspended since the pandemic and never resumed because of border clashes back in 2020. So this is a good first step. Not a huge newsworthy event in itself, but the courting of Modi and the courting of India against the backdrop of Washington's pressure on India India, because of their purchases of Russian oil to fuel the war in Ukraine, is offering Xi Jinping and the Chinese an opportunity, a diplomatic gift, if you will, for the SCO.
And big news this week, also the military parade in China. What are we expecting?
Yeah, well, about 26 world leaders are going to be there as well. Again, Modi not going to be in attendance. That is still part of that strategic autonomy, strategy from the Indians. But Kim Jong-un will be there, Vladimir Putin will be there, and other world leaders. One world leader has not come to SCO, will not be at the parade. That is Prabowo from Indonesia, because of the unrest that is happening in the streets of Jakarta. But again, we're going to have leaders from, well, here at SCO for sure. We're going to have, interestingly, the leader of Turkey, so Erdogan, which is a NATO nation, obviously, also Egypt, Malaysia, and others coming from around the world. Again, as Xi Jinping tries to portray, not only there's an alternative to the U.S.-led world order, but there is a military might that has been modernized here in China. So we're likely to see all the latest military hardware and technology, from drones to intercontinental ballistic missiles and hypersonic missiles, and to the latest jet fighters overhead in Tiananmen Square on Wednesday.
Stephen, thank you so much. Our Bloomberg Chief North Asia correspondent, Stephen Engel. And as Steve was just talking about, one leader that was absent from the SCO was the Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto. He is calling for calm following violent demonstrations over the weekend. Parliament has now scrapped controversial lawmaker perks that triggered public outrage over inequality and rising living costs. Let's bring in Bloomberg Southeast Asia Global business reporter Faris Mokhtar. So, Faris, talk us through what triggered the protest. What are the people demanding?
Yes, Avril. So, as you pointed out, the flashpoint was really the perks for the lawmakers in Parliament. And the people at this juncture are seeing economic slowdown, weakening consumption. And on top of that, they are viewing the lawmakers as rubbing salt on their wounds by demanding for, higher allowances, for example, more housing allowance. And these, frustrations have actually built up over the past few months as Indonesia see layoffs after layoffs, factories closing down because of, the domestic slowdown in that sense. And the requests by the lawmakers are seen as excessive and seen as, the political elites being out of touch with the ground.
The president has been in power for less than a year. So what is he trying to do in order to try to appease the public?
So the political parties met last evening, and the president delivered a statement saying that, they're scrapping those perks, that Parliament needs to be more in touch, with people's sentiments. Some are actually saying that, this, the statement, the intervention should have made earlier, before the fatalities happened, to calm the ground. And as you pointed out, Shery, since President Prabowo took over, it has been a tumultuous, reign for him. There were massive protests earlier in February. The stocks and markets plunged in March because of, concerns over his expensive, and expensive policies. So right now, for the government, the focus is to calm sentiments. Companies are already instituting work from home policies, out of precautionary measures that, protests could occur today and the ensuing days.
Faris, how much worse might it get for the president? What is the way forward now for him and his government?
Right now, the protest, what is actually sending to the lawmakers and to the government is that, the people are actually, really fed up with the economic situation. There is no stable salaries for them. It is hard to find a job. It is really a wake-up call for the political elites that the people will be watching and scrutinizing their every move. And that, should another display of excessive lifestyle by the politicians would trigger similar protests. Right now, the focus is really to calm the situation. The president has already said that, authorities would take firmer action should there be more, anarchy on the streets. tariffs. But right now, I think it is really trying to reconfigure how to govern Indonesia better and be more in touch with people's sentiments.
We have Indonesia's inflation data later today. The number is supposed to have stabilized for the month of August. What are we seeing in the broader economy and what the central bank can also do for the country?
Yes, so the central bank has constantly been intervening, whether it's because of geopolitical headwinds or is it because of, domestic instability. On a broader scope, what we have been seeing over the last few months is really weakening consumption. And that's pointing to, multiple factors, which is, people not being able to secure jobs. And those people include graduates, in fact. What you're seeing is that, people are not getting stable salaries because of the loss of jobs. And therefore, they can't really contribute much to the economy. And on top of the domestic instability and on top of the lack of clarity in terms of domestic policies, Indonesia has to contend with, the geopolitical headwinds from the tariffs. So it's kind of like a double whammy in that sense for the country. So right now, what the government is trying to do is just digging its heels and executing its policies. But at the same time, you are also seeing flexibility to intervene in the markets when needed and adjusting the policies when needed, which the president has done so far.
Faris, thank you so much. Faris Mokhtar for us, Bloomberg Southeast Asia global business reporter. Now, staying in Southeast Asia, turning to Thailand now, where political jostling is intensifying following the court-ordered ouster of Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra. The Pheu Thai party, backed by the Shinawatras' influential clan, met with executives of the People's Party to seek support to form a government. The People's Party is the single biggest group in parliament and is in pole position to anoint the next prime minister. We'll have analysis on what these upheavals mean this morning. The University of Melbourne's Asia Institute will join us to weigh in on the political turmoil unfolding in Thailand. And later on the China Show, the Council on Foreign Relations breaks down the protests rocking Indonesia. Shery.
Right, Avril, U.S. trading partners also facing increased uncertainty after a federal appeals court ruled that President Trump's global tariffs were issued illegally under an emergency law. Let's bring in Bloomberg senior editor Wendy Benjaminson. And Wendy, we're talking about the Liberation Day tariffs of about 10% as a baseline, right? So what happens next? What happens to global trade?
Well, nothing at the moment, Shery. The ruling said they were unconstitutional because the president used a little used economic law that is for economic emergencies, such as, we used it after the U.S. used it after the stock market crash of 2008, but hasn't been used since then and hadn't been used for a long time. So they said there was no such emergency that would justify the tariffs, and he can't do them. However, it also said that it would leave the tariffs in place while the lower court reviewed whether the tariff should be the affected tariff should be only the ones that companies sued for, or it should reflect all of the tariffs. And the White House is considering appealing this to the United States Supreme Court, which would then have to make a decision about whether these appellate courts ruled correctly. So there's a ways to go. So at the moment, nothing is happening. However, this is making planning for companies and for foreign countries very difficult, because at any moment, a court could rule on this. At any moment, there could be an appeal. So how long the current state of play remains, we have no idea.
More state of limbo for these global trading partners of the U.S. What is your sense of what options the Trump administration might have if these tariffs are indeed deemed illegal?
If they're deemed illegal, they're in a very awkward position, Avril, because this is how Trump said he would pay for the one big beautiful bill. Do you remember that bill that passed a couple of months ago? That cost $3.4 trillion. And the tariffs were supposed to bring in the revenue because he also cut the taxes, mostly for the wealthy, some for working class people, but by and large, the wealthy are getting tax cuts. He slashed federal spending. He's slashed foreign aid. And so all of these tax cuts, et cetera, that need to be paid for, were supposed to be paid for with tariff revenue. So they will have to go back and figure out where to get that revenue, or deficits and debt will soar.
Bloomberg senior editor Wendy Benjaminson there with the latest on President Trump's tariff strategy. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
Taking a look at the week ahead, South Korea's August exports data is due in the coming hours and may look weaker, though fewer working days likely skew the headline. On Wednesday, China is set to host a rare military parade marking the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Leaders expected to attend include North Korea's Kim Jong-un and Russia's Vladimir Putin. Elsewhere in the region, Australia's second quarter GDP due on Thursday. Expectations are that the economy likely picked up in the period on firmer household spending and construction. And a U.S. jobs report on Friday will either validate or upend bond traders' bets that the Fed will resume policy easing this month. That's your week ahead. But of course, over the weekend, we also got China's factory activity data. It remained stuck in contraction last month as a government crackdown on price wars held back output. Home sales also extended their slump in August, even as prices declined, and fresh stimulus from Shanghai and Beijing that was rolled out. Let's get more perspective with Illiana Jain. She is international economist at Westpac. So, Illiana, let's start with China. Are you seeing a bottom potentially yet when it comes to China factory activity, or are we just getting started because of the price wars?
Yeah, certainly. We've seen that the PMIs that came out, what drove that increase was prices. We saw an increase in producer prices within the PMIs data. We also saw an improvement in expectations for activity going ahead. Now, while this all sounds fantastic, it is also worth noting that the PMI figures are very weak when you compare it to history, particularly in the 10 years prior to the pandemic. So while we are starting to see that bottom for manufacturing activity start to emerge, but there are still certainly risks there going ahead.
What about the risk for countries such as Indonesia? I mean, we're also expecting some PMI numbers from there later this morning. The mood among manufacturers has already been pretty pessimistic. The recent unrest, to what extent do you think this compounds the risk for an economy like Indonesia?
Yeah, certainly. And for Indonesia, there are both external and domestic factors that are hampering growth. Externally, of course, it's that theme of tariffs and what that means for the redirection of trade, and also demand for a lot of the manufactured goods that are coming out of Indonesia. And now with these recent protests, the domestic picture is looking a little bit shaky as well. More than anything, this is going to feed into confidence for both businesses and consumers, and that's really where we're going to see the impact on the economy. That more subdued confidence starting to impact how businesses take forward production decisions as well as investment decisions, and consumers being a little bit more hesitant to spend more.
Is that sort of the mood throughout Southeast Asia? I mean, we do have political upheaval in Thailand as well. We have a central bank decision in Malaysia this week as well. But overall, we have seen how much they've all been hit because of President Trump's tariffs.
Yes, certainly. I think political uncertainty has been something that's been marked in Asia for this year. Earlier this year, we saw just how much the political uncertainty in both South Korea and Japan was impacting asset prices, the currency, as well as consumer confidence. And so when you have these big risk events, these political events that we're seeing across Southeast Asia, it's only going to make matters worse when it comes to growth in the broader region. And it's going to compound some of the moves that we're seeing from tariffs as well.
Yeah, we do have Korea export numbers today as well, not to mention Japanese capex data as well. When it comes to these economies in Northeast Asia, what will you be watching as the primary drivers of economic growth?
For them, it's just how quickly they're able to trade with one another and how quickly those trade flows are able to be diverted within the region. Of course, the other thing to note there is that we're starting to see activity from Asia to Europe start to increase. So to what extent does that increase in activity from Asia to Europe pick up the slack for anything we lose to the US? The other thing to mention there, of course, is we're also seeing a lot more trade pacts within Asia. We're seeing Japan and India meet this week and discuss further measures there. And so it's really about how much stronger they can become as a region through economic cooperation to kind of offset some of the impacts they're seeing when it comes to tariffs with the US.
How are you reading the risks from this tariff cut loss for the Trump administration for trading nations in the region?
For trading nations in the region, we're not seeing too much so far. A lot of that front running of tariffs meant that a lot of the export numbers that have come in have been quite strong. We're also seeing that some of these countries are starting to pivot and change the way that they export. So, for example, we can see that in Japan, export values declined quite sharply from April for autos. However, a lot of that was heavy discounting to kind of circumvent tariffs. Asian nations are probably going to try and circumvent tariffs in a range of different ways, whether it be exporting not final goods, intermediate goods to the US, or discounting them before they export them to the US. And so we're really seeing over the next 6 months how these tariffs are going to change the way Asia trades with the US. It'll be difficult to see a world in which volumes materially decline, especially given the specialty that Asia has in a lot of key sectors like semiconductors. It is quite important that the US keep trading with Asia, and they know that. Especially in the meantime while they build up their own domestic industries. So we're likely to see different ways that Asia navigates these tariff changes and gets around that.
Illiana, Jain, really good to have you with us, international economist at Westpac. We do have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg. Take a look at how U.S. futures are trading after we saw some downside on the Friday session. We had a month of gains, though, 4 months of gains for the S&P 500. We are headed towards a holiday break, but you can see the dollar also holding steady. When it comes to the stock market in the U.S., we have to keep in mind that September is usually the weakest month for U.S. shares. The S&P 500 has fallen 56% of the time in September. According to Bank of America, you do see institutional investor rebalancing, retail traders slowing their buying. Not to mention the volatility does pick up, but still the VIX, for example, about 20% below its one-year average. We'll be watching Treasury yields because two-year yields have continued to fall on Fed expectations of a cut. More ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
Let's take a look at how futures are shaping up in the Asia Pacific. Sydney pointing to some losses, and similar picture on the Nikkei. We could see some steep declines there, and all this against the backdrop of markets also needing some fresh assurances on economic stability and confirmation that the Fed will press ahead with easing so that we can see similar gains to last month, potentially. Now, the next few weeks, of course, that's going to give Wall Street a clearer reading potentially on whether the latest stock market rally will continue or might it get derailed. We have a jobs report, key inflation reading, the Fed's rate decision. All this is due. Let's bring in Garfield Reynolds, who leads Bloomberg's Markets Live coverage in Asia. So, Garf, what are you watching as the major catalyst between now and the Fed?
Well, the jobs data is the single biggest one. Up until we had the last jobs report, and in particular those shocking revisions down in jobs growth, the potential for a Fed rate cut in September was in many ways quite low, despite some bets that it would occur. However, once you had that poor labour market reading, that's the sort of thing that's always going to get the Fed's attention, and it definitely got a lot of attention, in particular, from what Jerome Powell outlined at Jackson Hole. It's clear that it came as a shock to him, and unless you get another flip-flop and you actually get a turnaround that shows that the jobs market is actually in a much better place, it's hard to see the Fed doing anything other than cutting rates. And in fact, the attention will be more on does the Fed cut once and then hold to make sure that inflation concerns are enough under control, or does it commit to cutting several times in a row? The latter option is mostly what equities are looking for, and for that matter, treasuries. The main concern, in fact, going into the jobs data, I think, is more, does it end up looking so bad that it turns out the Fed has indeed been too late to move, and so we are facing a more serious downturn than anybody is expecting right now?
Still, the possibility of a Fed rate cut this month leading to that rally both in the U.S. and the emerging markets posting the longest monthly gain since 2017. Could we see some downside in Southeast Asia, though, with the political upheaval both in Indonesia and also Thailand?
Yeah, those are definitely some ominous clouds hanging over Southeast Asia and indeed over the region in general. A reminder for investors that part of the reason for those cheaper valuations you see in the region is that you have the potential for political and economic instability. So Indonesian and Thai markets saw steep sell-offs on Friday. There's not too much that's gone on over the weekend that would indicate you're likely to get dip buyers coming in at this stage. Be interesting to see how much the Bank of Indonesia feels that it needs to intervene in order to keep the rupiah stable. So those are two very difficult sets of questions for investors when it comes to what's going on with those markets. More broadly, as you said, Asian markets have done very well in recent times, coming back from the shocks of reciprocal tariffs in April. We do have a number of challenges, including that court case on Friday, which raises the question of whether the tariffs stay in place. What does the Trump administration do if they ultimately get overturned? And also, how broad does the court decide to act in overturning tariffs if it does decide to overturn tariffs? So all of that is a reminder that there are plenty of risks out there, even if we do get a Fed rate cut. And amongst those, one of the things that we're watching in Asia this week is Japan and what goes on with the data there and whether that continues to build toward a BOJ rate hike next month, something that's likely to lead to some yen strength. And that also has the potential, as we've seen before, to create some unexpected consequences.
Yeah, we'll be watching that wage data on Friday in Japan. Garfield Reynolds, good to have you with us. He leads Markets Live coverage in Asia. We continue to watch the questions surrounding the Federal Reserve. Questions about whether President Trump had cause to oust Fed Governor Lisa Cook dominated a court hearing on Friday. The judge ended the 2-hour session without a ruling on Cook's request for a temporary order blocking Trump's efforts. Cook sued Trump after he moved to fire her over allegations of fraud in mortgage applications. Bloomberg spoke with former Kansas City Fed President Esther George about the case and its implications for Fed independence.
This is another step in an ongoing pressure and attack on the institution in terms of the authorities of the executive branch relative to the Federal Reserve. And so, however this plays out in terms of the details of the specific case that's been brought forward, I think what's at stake here for the American public is really to understand who will be influential in the decisions that the Federal Reserve makes in the years to come.
And personnel determines policy, as we've heard so many times from this administration. And the concern here is that the president will next target the appointments or the renewal of appointments of regional Fed presidents in February of next year. How concerned are you about that?
Well, I think it would be very concerning, and I'll tell you why, Scarlett. If you think about the origins of this institution, they were firmly anchored in making sure that political pressure would be as limited as possible in terms of the critical decisions that the Federal Open Market Committee has to make for the long run. And so the idea that you would structure the institution in a way that would protect that long run view and not drive it in the direction of short run decisions was critical. And it proved to be relatively durable over the last 100 plus years. So that's what's at stake, I think, as we look at how this unfolds, is how will the decision-making process of this institution play out and really take a more long-term focus as opposed to shorter-term interest.
And Esther, how much of a distraction is this for Fed officials? Again, we do have a closely watched Fed decision next month, given the back and forth with President Donald Trump.
Yeah, so there is a lot of noise going on, and I think it's most unfortunate because there is already enough uncertainty that's coming at the decision they have to make relative to the performance of the economy.
Former Kansas City Fed President Esther George speaking with our colleagues Scarlett Fu and Bailey Lipschultz. Now, we'll have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
We're headed towards the Japan market opens with little change on the Japanese yen against the U.S. dollar, although we did see a month of gains for August. The Nikkei stock market also up in the past week as well. But what we'll be watching is also the JGB space, because we saw futures climbing in the previous session. There were reports that the finance ministry had asked primary dealers for their views on reducing issuance of super long bonds, which is why we had super long bonds actually firming up. We are going to get capex data out of Japan in just a few minutes as well. We're following geopolitics as well, with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Japanese counterpart Shigeru Ishiba pledging deeper ties as U.S. tariffs start to bite. Modi says India has secured an investment pledge of up to $68 billion from Tokyo. Let's bring in Bloomberg economics and government reporter Yoshiaki Nohara. Yoshiaki, so what was discussed in the summit between Prime Minister Modi and Ishiba, and why is this relationship so important?
You know, the major takeaway from this summit was that both Japan and India were able to show that how much they want the business and economic ties with each other. And this is important because both nations are facing a similar challenge, which is the higher U.S. tariffs.
So what is next for Ishiba and Modi?
Well, the next for Modi is obviously he's in China. So it's another relationship he needs to manage that now the India's relationship with the U.S. has been solved because of the higher tariffs. For Ishiba, he continues to face some kind of pressure to step down following the election, poor election results last month. But I'm not sure if we can say that that pressure is escalating at this point, but this week we'll see the analysis of the election loss, which is going to be a kind of a key moment to decide whether he will stay on or step down.
And you mentioned U.S. tariffs. Of course, we do have the top trade negotiator of Japan headed to D.C. That visit was actually canceled last week. What can we expect on that front?
Well, what's going on is that the trade deal was reached kind of in a surprising way in late July, but none of the implementations of the trade deal has taken place at this point. So the cancellation of his trip suggests that there's still some gap between the two nations to hammer out whether the U.S. wants this investment vehicle that Japan pledged to start before they sign the officially the tariffs cuts. But of course, Japan wants the tariffs cuts as soon as possible, and we are not to be able to see yet the both sides coming together on the timing. When is the best time to get going on these two fronts?
What do you think would be a good outcome? Help us manage expectations for these trade negotiations this week.
Well, I mean, it's a tough question. It's a good question. But, another thing to keep in mind is that the deal has been made already. And right now, it's a matter of details. So obviously, the more Japan can come across as pressing ahead for quick implementation of the deal, it's going to be great looking for its residents. But at the same time, the U.S. has to do the same, that, it doesn't just lower the tariffs without investment coming in to the U.S. So there's both conflicts, both sides have incentives to how to present themselves so that they're looking for right moment to deliver what they have promised to do.
Bloomberg economics and government reporter Yoshiaki Nohara there. Great to have you with us, but let's discuss the geopolitics here a little bit more with Paul Nadeau, adjunct associate professor in political science at Temple University, Japan. Paul, great to have you with us. We were talking with Yoshi about the India-Japan relationship, the Japan-U.S. relationship. I want to ask you about the implications of these three relationships together, because if you have the U.S. stepping back from the Indo-Pacific strategy and having a more tense relationship with India, what does it mean for Japan?
Well, I would step back a little bit and say that the Modi-Ishiba meeting is a good reminder that stuff happens beyond Donald Trump, no matter how much he wants us to think otherwise. Japan and India have been cooperating increasingly over the past few years. There have been lots of investment, lots of cooperation on things like autos, possibly more cooperation on things like robotics, semiconductors, nuclear, that sort of stuff. So both countries, both leaders have reasons to cooperate with one another beyond anything that Donald Trump might be forcing them into. Now, that said, as you and as Yoshiaki, your previous guest, just said quite rightly, the U.S. is pushing them together. I think this is much more of an accelerant than something that would have happened in the absence of the United States pressure. Both countries are going to get hit very significantly with tariffs, India and Japan both. And both countries are going to need to cooperate with one another to boost their economic resiliency, to boost their supply chain resiliency, to make sure that they can weather this coming storm as much as possible.
All aspects of the cooperation that you're referring to, though, are more business and trade. What about the geopolitics and the political alignment between China and between Japan and India at a time when you're also seeing India get closer to China as well?
Well, if you're a China hawk in the United States, this situation is not great. This is not the situation you would have wanted. You would have wanted India and Japan to sort of be part of an arc, so to speak, that would help contain China, even deter China if you're really hawkish. And so to see Trump alienate, frankly, Narendra Modi in the way that he has, and for the reason that he has, it's not really a geopolitical reason whatsoever. He's just miffed that Modi won't back him up for the Nobel Peace Prize. That's not great if you're really thinking about trying to build a coalition or some kind of alignment against Chinese coercion, whether that's economic, political, security, what have you. Now, I won't go so far as to say that the possible coalition or alignment is fracturing because, outside of the United States, Japan and India both have reasons to be concerned about China's coercion. That, again, exists without Donald Trump in the room. But without having the United States at their back, or at least having the United States at their back, but much more wobbly and much more inconsistent, is not really ideal. So I think this kind of alignment, tightening this alignment between Japan and India, makes a lot of sense.
And you mentioned earlier that for Trump, maybe he might not welcome this in the sense that things happen in spite of him. We are seeing more centralized decision-making from the administration in a way. What is your assessment of how the tariff developments might progress, especially now that we're seeing it being deemed illegal potentially by a court?
Yeah. I mean, the legality cloud is something that's going to hang over this whole thing. Now, I will be clear that even if the ruling stands, even if the Supreme Court affirms the decision that these tariffs are not legal, Donald Trump still has ways to impose tariffs. He's got a whole host of options available to him that are on more firm legal ground. Now, they're not ideal in the sense that you either need to get Congress on board, which is to say have members of Congress take a vote on tariffs, which is not ideal if you're a member up for re-election next year, or you have to go sector by sector. You tariff steel, you tariff autos, you tariff semiconductor, you tariff the whole work, every sector, as many sectors as you want. So he has options. Even if the April 2nd, the quote-unquote liberation tariffs go away, tariffs are still going to be a significant part of Donald Trump's economic strategy. Now, how other countries are responding to that is hard to say. I mean, we've seen all the deals that went down in July sort of indicate that even with all the questions around the IEEPA tariffs, countries still take it fairly seriously. They still want to respond in a way that keeps the U.S. in the room constructively as far as it can be. But with this new decision, I would not be surprised one bit to see countries start to maybe slow walk the negotiations a little bit, maybe take their time, hem and haw a little bit more. And the other thing is that you're almost seeing the very, very bare indications from the Trump administration itself that these specific tariffs may not be able to stand up, with Besson's comment about how it would be a real embarrassment. Like, yes, of course it would be a real embarrassment. That's not a surprise. But why are you saying that out loud? That's a little weird to me, frankly. So this new decision, while not a surprise to me as somebody who's been following this, does have the potential this time, this moment, to maybe have an impact on the negotiations.
Paul Nadeau, really good to have you with us, adjunct associate professor in political science at Temple University, Japan. We do have breaking news out of Japan. We are getting the capital spending data for the second quarter, surprising to the upside, growth of 7.6% year on year. This is an acceleration not only from the previous month, but also coming in well above estimates. Estimates were for growth of around 6.1%. So just comes to show you that businesses continue to increase capital investments. And this was sort of the same picture that we had in the first quarter. And again, surprising to the upside, 7.6% growth, which will have implications for the Bank of Japan that's been trying to really gauge business sentiment on its decision to hike rates. We do have wage growth data also later in the week. Catch Japan Ahead every Monday at 8:40 a.m. If you're watching in Tokyo, subscribers can watch live on the terminal using the TV Go function. This is Bloomberg.
Here's the latest from the corporate front. U.S.-listed shares of Alibaba soared on Friday after the Chinese e-commerce giant reported a surge in revenue from China's AI boom. The company posted a triple-digit percentage gain in first-quarter AI-related product revenue, helping offset a surprise drop in profit. The Wall Street Journal has also reported that Alibaba created a chip capable of operating AI services as Nvidia faces hurdles in selling its products in China. We'll be watching China's EV giant BYD as well when it starts trading later. The firm posted a surprise drop in quarterly profit amid fierce price competition in China. Net income fell 30% last quarter, missing estimates with margins shrinking to their weakest since 2023. Meantime, the Trump administration is tightening chip export rules for South Korea's Samsung and SK Hynix. Washington is revoking waivers for both firms to use U.S. technologies in their Chinese operations. The companies have been operating in China under regulations that allow them to import chip-making equipment without applying for a new license each time, Shery.
And on that news, April will be watching Samsung and SK Hynix. We're also keeping an eye on Asian semiconductor names. Alibaba moving to develop its own AI accelerator chip, which could cut Chinese reliance on external suppliers such as Nvidia. Do watch out for those Hyundai names as well, as there's speculation that there could be more restructuring moves to come in Hyundai Group, with speculation over the health of Hyundai Motor Group's honorary chairman. So set up for succession is a big news among Hyundai Group names. The market opens are next. This is Bloomberg. This is the Asia Trade. We're counting down to Asia's major market opens. The first trading session of the month of September, traditionally a weak month when it comes to U.S. stocks. April will be following the follow-through here across Asia, of course, as we watch geopolitics unfold with world leaders gathered in Shanghai.
That's right, Shery. And as there are some developments on the chip front as well, with the U.S. revoking waivers, surprisingly, for the likes of SK Hynix and Samsung Electronics for them to ship to China. So as you say, geopolitics really in the backdrop here, Shery.
Yeah, those are some of the stocks that we'll be watching at the open right now. But take a look at how we're setting up for the Japanese session, because we had seen a week of gains for Japanese stock markets. The Japanese yen not doing much in the previous session, but we saw a month of gains against the U.S. dollar. We'll be watching JGBs as well. Reports that the Finance Ministry has asked primary dealers for their views on reducing issuance of super long bonds. That firmed up that part of the yield curve. We were also watching the second quarter capital spending numbers coming out just minutes ago, rising and surprising to the upside, 7.6% growth year on year. A very key factor for what the BOJ could do next. We do have wage growth numbers on Friday as well. Take a look at how South Korea is opening at the moment. We have August export numbers rising 1.3% year on year, which is coming below expectations. But remember, August was a month of fewer working days, so you have to factor that in. We had also seen the import numbers contraction of more than expected, 4% year on year. So that left a trade surplus of $6.51 billion US dollars. Of course, very important to watch the export numbers in South Korea for an indication of where global trade is going, as we're also watching some idiosyncratic names, as we talked about SK Hynix, the chip makers, including, of course, Samsung Electronics as well, and some of those Hyundai Group names because of speculation of restructuring, April.
And talking about idiosyncratic moves, we're also going to be watching some of the Chinese chip-related stocks along with Alibaba, as it seems to be making some headway when it comes to its AI-accelerated chips. But let's take a look at the Australian session. We're seeing the ASX 200 dipping about 0.2%. Aussie holding steady against the greenback. Of course, we are seeing cash trading shut for treasuries. Futures are pointing to some downside. We do have data from the US at the end of the week, the jobs report, and all this ahead of course, the Fed's meeting in a couple of weeks from now. So let's bring in Ron Temple, Chief Market Strategist at Lazard. Ron, I wonder if you could just first weigh in, because we did get numbers out of Japan on capital expenditure. That looked quite strong. We know this tells us about longer term how businesses are planning in the country. What is your sense of the extent in which this solidifies the bet for a BOJ hike in October?
I'm still a bit skeptical that we'll get a rate hike from the BOJ in October. And frankly, I'm skeptical that we would get one even by the end of the year. The markets are saying about an 80% chance of one 25 basis point hike by year end. I think given the amount of uncertainty in the global backdrop, though, the BOJ would be well served not to raise rates. We'll have to wait for any additional signals there. Clearly, inflation running well above their target. But I think, again, there are some clear signs, if you look in the data, that inflation will fade as we move through the next year. And so I'm a bit skeptical in terms of that rate hike likelihood.
How do you feel about Japanese stocks, so as a way to position, diversify away from the U.S.?
Yeah, I'm positive on Japanese equities, but I think it's absolutely critical to be actively managing your exposure in Japan. To me, when I look at Japan, this is not a macroeconomic growth story. You know, the structural issues around demographics, around the burden of debt have not really changed. But what I see that's really exciting in Japan is finally we have basically a three-part thesis. Deflation is dead. Number two, corporate governance reforms and changes to the corporate takeover code are forcing companies to basically better manage their capital base and their operations. And number three, we continue to see flows of capital in the household sector out of bank deposits and currency into riskier assets. And so I do think the companies that have basically gotten religion in terms of improving their returns on capital will deliver better returns to shareholders and can basically give you somewhat of an idiosyncratic play in a world where U.S. market gyrations tend to move the rest of the markets to some degree upward or downward.
That's what I was going to ask, is about relative attractiveness, right? So, for example, if you compare it to the United States, we have seen, of course, valuations already pretty stretched, tech rallying, and on top of that, September is supposed to be a weaker month. So does this mean that you would take money a little bit off the table in the U.S. and go elsewhere, including Japan?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, by the way, if you look back over the last 17 or 18 years, literally from late 2007 all the way through the end of 2024, U.S. equities have significantly outperformed almost all major developed and even emerging market equity markets. I think for investors, it's time to reevaluate that asset allocation. You know, the U.S. is 74% of the MSCI World Index, 64% of the All Country World Index. That is a really high exposure driven in part by those years of outperformance. But in my view, we're at the beginning of the end of American exceptionalism. GDP growth rates are structurally slowing down. Inflation's likely to be higher than most markets for the next 1 to 2 years. And I think there are many other factors that led to the U.S. being seen as the gold standard, you know, from a currency perspective, the reserve currency, treasuries, the safest place to park your money, and equities, a great place to get growth. I think different facets of those arguments are being chiseled away at this point, and the valuation is very stretched. So I think it's a very good time for investors to be looking at non-U.S. markets.
And by non-U.S. markets, would you also lean towards emerging markets? We have seen the longest winning streak on a monthly basis since 2017. But at the same time, how much of that was just China? And would you up your bet on China as well?
My favorite market at this point is emerging markets, and that's on a 5 to 10 year view. We've had, again, that extended period of underperformance in emerging markets. It's always hard to disentangle how much is just driven by China. But when I look at emerging markets, I see growing economies. Yes, there are issues. I mean, what we're seeing recently in Indonesia and Thailand are great reminders that you can have political instability in different countries that can be temporary, can become more extended. But when I look at the broader growth opportunities in these markets, I look at a valuation that is 9 PEs, 9 multiples cheaper than the United States. And by the way, over the next 12 months, where you're likely to get better earnings growth in emerging markets than the U.S., I think this is a story that goes well beyond China and is a very attractive one for investors.
For markets such as South Korea, though, there's still a sort of headwinds when it comes to chips. I mean, we're seeing how they're ending up in the crosshairs of the Trump administration with a revoking of some of these waivers. How are you including that in your assessment?
Yeah, I think that's a great point in terms of, you know, in developed markets, many times, well, increasingly it's true of all markets, you're always trying to look as an investor, as an analyst or a portfolio manager. Your goal is to forecast the cash flows of a company, then figure out what the right discount rate is, to figure out what today's fair value is. But when you move into emerging markets, you also tend to have to layer on all kinds of other complexities around issues such as geopolitics, rule of law, government policy changes, et cetera. And so I think it's really critical, regardless of the country you're looking in, that you have a really firm grasp of the fundamentals of each company, understand how macro and geopolitical factors can affect those fundamentals, and put a price on it. And even with all of those kind of headwinds or cross currents, I do think you've still got some exceptionally good opportunities across emerging markets, including some companies within Korea and a broad range of markets in the global EM.
Yeah, we'll be watching SK Hynix and Samsung Electronics, given, of course, those chip news that you guys mentioned. Ron Temple, good to have you with us, Chief Market Strategist at Lazard. Take a look at some of the other movers in the South Korean session, especially the Hyundai names, because we have speculation of more restructuring to come, especially with news that Hyundai Heavy is now absorbing Hyundai Mipo in December. Also speculation over the health of Hyundai Group's honorary chairman, raising bets of a series of restructuring moves for succession. And you can see right there a little bit of a mixed picture, but do keep an eye on those Hyundai shares that rallied in the previous session. This is Bloomberg.
Being friendly neighbors and mutually supportive partners and realizing the dragon and elephant dancing together should be the right choice for both sides.
Chinese President Xi Jinping speaking about ties with India during his meeting with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The two leaders met at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Tianjin on Sunday. Bloomberg's chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel joins us from the event. And Steve, what came out of those summit talks?
Well, there's going to be more talks, no doubt, with Xi and Putin and Xi and Modi and other leaders, more than 20 leaders here at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO, in its 24th, 25th year. It was formed in 2001. Hasn't really been able to generate a unified voice, but this is the biggest gathering so far, led by, of course, one of the founding nations, China. And Xi Jinping, they're kind of controlling the narrative a little bit. We're here in the media center, which is next door to the main venue for the leaders gathering, but they kind of have the media sequestered here. So there's not a lot of cross-pollination between politicians and press right now. So we're hoping to get more headlines out as the morning goes on, as Xi again hosts these other leaders. So this is the first time in many years you're going to have the leaders of China, of Russia, of India, of Pakistan, and Iran all on the same podium talking about their shared interests amid, of course, the trade war launched by Donald Trump earlier this year. So again, the Xi-Modi dynamic is the one that we're really watching closely for a number of different headlines, hopefully, other than what we've gotten so far, and that is Modi announcing that China and India are going to resume direct flights. They were halted during the pandemic, but never resumed because of bad blood that generated between China and India over border disputes. But now we don't have a time frame, but flights are going to resume. We already heard that Indigo has expressed interest to have a resumption of those flights, and I would assume Air India will also be a part of that. We, again, don't have a time frame. But I talked about the headlines. What kind of headlines are we going to get at the end of the SCO later today? Will there be a cohesive, unified statement coming from the SCO? So far, headlines in the China Daily have been similar to this, fairly vague comments. SCO to chart course for a shared future. That is obvious, no doubt. But are we going to get any oil deals or energy deals between China and Russia? Are we going to get further announcements for the burgeoning relationship between India and China? That's what we're waiting for.
Yeah, as we wait for that, we're also looking ahead to the military parade where China can showcase its military might, but it's also coming against the backdrop of a purge in the PLA. Does that take some of the shine off?
Well, obviously, we know the background of the PLA, and it has definitely modernized its military. But there has been a purge of top officers in the defense ministry, as well as within the ranks of generals in the People's Liberation Army. That is for sure. So there's a tightening of discipline by Xi Jinping within the military ranks. But at the same time, there's also been an extreme modernization push of the military with drone technologies, with hypersonic missile technologies, with intercontinental ballistic missile technology, and of course their fighter jets and their stealth fighters and their bombers, which will most likely fly over Beijing and Tiananmen Square on Wednesday, when there will be that big military parade. I was at the last one. Well, there was one 5 years ago, but the last time that they celebrated or marked the end of the World War II, the 70th anniversary, we were there in Tiananmen Square. We're going to be there again on Wednesday, along with up on the dais there above the Mao poster painting. You're going to see Xi Jinping, no doubt, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un, among other world leaders. Narendra Modi, not scheduled to participate. Again, that is very likely part of its strategic autonomy policy that the Indians have maintained with diplomatic relations. I go back to that because that is really the main story right now here at the SCO, the China-India relationship, and how far does India go in building the relationship with India at a time when Washington is imposing 50% tariffs on New Delhi because of India's purchase of Russian oil. So that is the big dynamic we'd like to flesh out here at the SCO.
Yeah, Bloomberg Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel there on site as we continue to follow the Indian Prime Minister's busy schedule. Of course, you also met with the Japanese counterpart Shigeru Ishiba, pledging deeper ties as U.S. tariffs bite. Modi now saying that India has secured an investment pledge of up to $68 billion from Tokyo. The deal is part of a broader economic pact focused on semiconductors, critical minerals, and also artificial intelligence. U.S. trading partners are facing increased uncertainty after federal appeals court in the U.S. ruled that President Trump's global tariffs were issued illegally under an emergency law. Bloomberg News Desk editor Jill Deasy joins us now with the latest. And Jill, pretty confusing for partners because you've had these U.S. trade deals, and yet Washington hasn't necessarily cut the tariffs to those agreed rates. And on top of that, you have these local rulings that may signal that these so-called Liberation Day tariffs are illegal. So are there any immediate implications for trade?
Yes, good morning. Yes, the entire situation, I think, is also adding to the confusion here because while the court did deem these illegal and we still need to wait to see what exactly the Trump administration's path forward may be, it could be that they potentially appeal this to the Supreme Court. This appellate court has said that the tariffs can stay in place while they're working through the courts. And so now you do have the situation where you have some of these lower courts that have ultimately said that these, as you said, the Liberation Day tariffs, remember remember, that covers anything that was announced as part of that big, the Liberation Day so-called reciprocal tariff figures that Trump has announced, some of the deals that were negotiated after that are looking at these on a country basis. That's all really what's being thrown into question here. So you've got a bunch of, tariffs on Canada, Mexico, some of those additional tariffs that were agreed to, a lot of these other regional tariffs that we're talking about. I mean, you're seeing Trump here, he's saying, yes, all the tariffs are still in effect. That's true, because that's what the judge has, or this court has ultimately allowed to continue. But the fact that we still don't have a final resolution when it comes to the courts does leave open the question of whether these could all be deemed illegal somewhere down the line.
Jill, one of our guests earlier in the program talked about how he wouldn't be surprised if this latest development actually takes some of the heat off the immediacy of negotiations. We know how the U.S. and Japan trade talks, those are set to resume. What are we expecting from Akazawa in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when it comes to some of these U.S.-Japan talks, what's been really a sticking point there is that there were some tariff levies or levels related to autos that were apparently agreed to a little bit earlier this summer. It does seem like there's been some kind of a holdup in terms of agreeing to rice purchases. The U.S. wants Japan to agree to more rice purchases from Japan. So again, some sticking points there. But I think the broader issue with the U.S.-Japan negotiations here just shows you that even in the case of some of these nations that did agree with the Trump administration to, various, different levies or different agreements, I mean, there's still, something that's open here. And again, I think it really just goes to reflect the fact that it's really, really difficult to reach a comprehensive trade agreement in a matter of weeks or months. Often, pre-Trump 2.0, we saw these types of agreements take in some cases years to negotiate. And it does kind of set up the fact that, even with some of these agreements in place, you do have, occasions where countries might be trying to negotiate with the U.S. for better deals or for more complex issues. I mean, these are really, really complex subjects. And now you've added in the fact that a lot of these deals aren't necessarily completely 100% negotiated with this, potential uncertainty over how, some of the stuff could be thrown out in courts ultimately.
Jill, thank you so much. Bloomberg News Desk editor Jill Deesis for us. Turning to Indonesia as well, one of the countries that are facing these tariff risks. But domestically, we know how the president, Prabowo Subianto, is calling for calm following violent demonstrations over the weekend. Parliament has now scrapped controversial lawmaker perks that triggered public outrage over inequality and rising living costs. Let's bring in Soraya Permatasari, Bloomberg editor based in Jakarta. So, talk to us first, Soraya, about how we got to this stage. Why is there so much unhappiness among the people?
Yes, thank you, and good morning from Jakarta. So the protest really began last Monday when hundreds of students and groups rallied against a significant pay increase for lawmakers. Now, this is at a time when the economy is not looking too well. Inequality issue, corruption cases, job losses in the tens of thousands since the start of the year, especially in the textile industry. Now, all these things are creating frustration among the people, especially in the Indonesian working class. But the situation escalated dramatically when a motorcycle taxi driver was killed after being run over by a speeding armored police vehicle. And he was there to deliver a package, so he wasn't even part of the protest. The incident then caught on video and rapidly spread in group chats and on social media turned what initially appeared to be manageable protests, because as you know, Indonesia is not new to protest. It turned into the most serious test yet for President Prabowo Subianto, who is only like 10 months into his term. And by Friday, the main stock index had slipped 1.5%, the worst performer in the world at the time, and the rupiah fell deeper than its peers in Asia. That prompted the Bank Indonesia to say that, they will stay in the market. As of Sunday night,
Is there anything else that the president can do at this point?
Yeah, so President Prabowo, after canceling his trip to China, he then held meetings with political leaders and his cabinet ministers. in a televised address afterwards, he gave a strong warning against protesters who act unlawfully and destroy public properties. He ordered the police and the military, who's been asked to help, to take the firmest response if needed. But he also, as you know, announced that Parliament has actually agreed to drop the controversial housing allowance of 50 million rupiah a month. Now, that's slightly more than $3,000, or nearly 10 times the minimum wage in the capital. As of now, there are still pockets of protests at the capital as well as in other cities. And in anticipation of further arrests, the provincial government has advised people to actually work from home today.
So these protests could continue for a while yet, but I wanted to pick on something that you touched on earlier about Prabowo having to cancel his trip to China. This is coming at a time where presumably it would make sense for closer ties with Beijing amid the tariff backdrop. What are the implications there?
Well, I think it was something that actually was kind of expected. Of course, it remains to be seen whether he's going there, once the situation has calmed down a bit. But yeah, that is something that we should watch for over the next few days.
Soraya, thank you so much. Bloomberg editor Soraya Permatasari. Turning to Thailand, political jostling there is intensifying following the court-ordered ouster of Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra. The Pheu party, backed by the Shinawatras' influential clan, met with executives of the People's Party to seek support to form a government. The People's Party is the single biggest group in parliament and is in pole position to anoint the next Prime Minister. We'll have analysis on what these upheavals mean this morning. The University of Melbourne's Asia Institute will join us later this hour to weigh in on the political turmoil unfolding in Thailand. And later on the China Show, the Council on Foreign Relations breaks down the protests rocking Indonesia. We'll have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
Take a look at how European futures are trading after downside pressure on Friday. UK lenders dropped after a think tank suggested a windfall tax on commercial banks. Of course, September, a big month for France. We do have the confidence vote on September 8th. This week, we do have Euro area flash inflation, Swiss inflation data, also UK housing pricing as well. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg. Take a look at the early trading session across Asia. We are seeing Nikkei stocks being led higher by healthcare, consumer staples, but tech stocks under pressure right now. Do watch out for those chip stocks across South Korea as well. The Trump administration will revoke waivers for Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix to use U.S. technologies in their Chinese operations. You can see Hyundai names outperforming right there on the chart on the right, given that there are speculation of restructuring moves that could take these stocks higher. The ASX 200, a downside of 0.2%, Avril.
Yeah, and Shery, while you were speaking, we're just getting some of these data points crossing the terminal. The S&P Global manufacturing PMIs for a slew of economies, including Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. So let's start with South Korea first. We are seeing it pick up a little from the prior reading to 48.3. For Japan, it is coming in at 49.7. And for Taiwan, sitting at 47.4. So a bit better than the prior reading for Taiwan. But of course, for these major economies, it is still stuck in contraction. And also in Indonesia, where we are similarly getting those PMI numbers, 51.5. This is a faster pace than the prior reading, which was in contraction of 49.2. We have there as well data from the Philippines in expansion on these manufacturing PMIs. Now, as we've just been unpacking there, Indonesia, some data coming in from the PMI manufacturing, but the country is also in the spotlight as the president has called for calm after violent demonstrations over the weekend, and Parliament has now scrapped controversial lawmaker perks that triggered public outrage over inequality and rising living costs. Meanwhile, in Thailand, political jostling is intensifying, and this is after the court-ordered ouster of Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra. Joining us now is Vedi Hadiz, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Melbourne's Asia Institute. Really good to have you with us. Let's start off, Professor, with Indonesia. As we see, there's been long-running discontent about these lawmakers' allowances. Why have things, in your mind, boiled over at this stage?
Well, the rioting, the protests express really long simmering discontent, which are culminating now in the sorts of scenes you're seeing in Jakarta now. I mean, the fact of the matter is that young people in particular are finding it very hard to find jobs. The middle class is being squeezed, and there is widespread perception that the elites are completely out of touch with the situation of ordinary people. And then when the lawmakers got these exorbitant perks, I think it just tapped into a lot of those simmering angers. But the thing is that even though the anger is organic, is genuine and valid, I think that it is possible that elite forces are trying to take advantage of these, and therefore we see that the situation has escalated, and there's a lot of elite wheeling and dealing happening behind the scenes.
Could you share a bit more on that? Elite dealing behind the scenes. What are the implications for Indonesian politics?
Well, look, the thing is this, I don't want to take away from the genuine nature of the anger, but we also know that there is a growing schism between Prabowo Subianto's camp, the president, and that of his predecessor, Jokowi. It seems to me improbable that a situation such as this would not somehow feed in to some of their political calculation in terms of balancing their position vis-a-vis each other. And this, I think, is shown by the fact that Prabowo has recently just brought in all of the leaders of the political parties in Indonesia to make sure that they will support his actions in dealing with the unrest, and to make sure that opponents, whether overt or covert, will not be able to take advantage of the situation. I think a lot of people have missed the fact that after that meeting with the political leaders, there was a series of points that came out, and they might have missed that he did mention indications of treason and terror. And that is, in political lingo, sort of questioning whether there's people behind all of this.
So do you expect the president to survive this upheaval? And we have seen, of course, them trying to revoke those lawmaker perks, but will that be enough, and what else can he do?
Well, I think that revoking the lawmakers' perks was the logical minimum step to take. And they've also, he's also convinced the parties to withdraw their controversial members who have made statements which seem to have just made people angrier than they had been. But the problem is that there are fundamental issues in Indonesia which will continue to beleaguer his government. And the thing is that he is actually tied up with a lot of the interests that, for example, continue in making sure that Indonesian government, politics and economics is run by or driven by the logic of corruption. Right. It's just, inescapable for him to be dealing with these things. And in fact, all of his allies are implicated in these sorts of practices.
And before we let you go, of course, we see political upheaval in Thailand as well with the ouster of Prime Minister Shinawatra. We know that the People Party is being courted by rival groups as well. Does that have implications for the landscape of politics in Thailand, and what can we expect next?
Well, as you know, there will be, there is planned to be a parliamentary vote to set up an interim government. And what's happening now is, elite party wheeling and dealing. Really, the main question is whether the People's Party, used to be the Move Forward Party, will support the conservative candidate Anutin, or will they go with the Putai candidate Chai Kasem? It seems like Anutin has the upper hand at the moment, but it really depends on whether the PP is convinced that either of those candidates will deliver on the promise of having elections as soon as possible, because the PP rightly think that they would win such an election.
Vedi, it's really good to get your insights. Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Melbourne's Asia Institute, thank you so much. We do have more ahead on the Asia Trade. This is Bloomberg. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit is underway in the Chinese city of Tianjin. The biggest event on China's diplomatic calendar of the year has brought together world leaders to map out the future of the bloc, looking to offer an alternative to a U.S. world order. Indian Prime Minister Modi is using his trip to reset relations with China while also seeking to strengthen ties with Russia. Of course, this all amid the U.S. trade war. Let's bring in Henrietta, Levin Senior Fellow in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Henrietta, good to have you with us. Of course, we had President Xi Jinping already meet in a bilateral summit with Prime Minister Modi. What do you think was the biggest takeaway from this summit talks, and what will you be watching out for in the next few days?
Well, thank you so much for having me. And to take a step back, the China-India relationship has been improving, even before the Trump administration, all the way back to last fall when there was a breakthrough on the border. And we have seen incremental progress when it comes to restoring direct flights between India and China, recent progress on visas. But it does seem like Prime Minister Modi's meeting with President Xi in Tianjin did really accelerate this rapprochement. The tone of the meeting was incredibly positive, lots of language about partnership and collaboration. I expect we will see additional concrete economic cooperation in the coming weeks and months. And I think we'll see that unfold at a much accelerated pace as a result of Washington's almost inexplicable decision to layer 50% tariffs on Delhi, giving Delhi an extra incentive to diversify its economic relationships and also to show Washington that it can. At the same time, there is a real ceiling on how far India will be willing to go when it comes to Beijing. There's still a lot of distrust on the border. Delhi is not about to forgive Beijing for its longstanding and ongoing support for India's arch rival Pakistan, including in the military domain. And so, in a way, thinking of the international perspective, I think Washington is quite lucky that even as it immolates the U.S.-India relationship, Delhi has its own reasons to keep a little bit of distance from Beijing. And so when we think about that broader context, I wouldn't be surprised if the U.S. goes to Delhi asking to collaborate on...
But does the U.S. have an Indo-Pacific strategy at this point? I mean, everything that was achieved during the Biden administration, how much of that is still in place? And could we see a reset after this administration? Where does Washington see the U.S.-India relationship going from here?
It's a great question. I think the challenge is there is no single Indo-Pacific strategy. There is no single China strategy coming out of Washington. You see many different strategies with different priorities playing out at once. So on the one hand, Secretary Rubio, the Secretary of State, has convened numerous meetings with his Quad counterparts, a grouping very dependent on Indian goodwill with India, Japan, Australia, and the US. On the other hand, you see President Trump, through his economic agencies, layering on these brutal tariffs with very little strategic rationale. So I think you'll continue to see a number of strategies playing out at once that are sometimes conflicting with each other.
What about how the Chinese president, who is meeting with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, how is he likely to strike that balance without potentially widening the schism with European countries?
It's a great question. President Xi is deeply committed on what seems to be a personal level to his relationship with President Putin and the China-Russia partnership. And you see Xi trying to go as far as he can to support the Russian war effort in Ukraine by providing economic and financial support, by providing really critical dual-use inputs to the Russian defense industrial base, but just trying to stop right short of where he would do irreversible damage in his mind to the China-Europe relationship, because he does still prize this long-standing Chinese effort to split the transatlantic alliance. And with Washington being so flexible towards allies at this time, China does see an opportunity with Europe that it doesn't want to lose. And so it will be interesting to see how she tries to strike that balance after meeting with Putin in Tianjin.
You were alluding to some of this earlier. What is your sense of how pivotal potentially this week is going to be as a sort of pushback to the U.S.'s global order?
I think that is a critical perspective on the summit. China has always seen the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as a critical vehicle for advancing an alternative vision of world order. And so that's why, for example, Beijing prizes so highly that the UN Secretary General attends these meetings, in addition to many nation-state partners. And so you see China trying to seize this moment of policy reversal in Washington to advance an international order that is more friendly to Chinese interests, to China's authoritarian political system, while also demonstrating the incredible convening power that we see on display in Tianjin. And I think Beijing is trying to show not only that it is making progress in building this alternative order, but that there's support for it in the region and more broadly.
And Henrietta, we do have, of course, Kim Jong-un at the military parade this week. When it comes to the North Korean nuclear issue, do you expect perhaps not necessarily progress, but more attention focused on Pyongyang, especially given that we're headed towards APEC in Korea as well?
I think that Kim Jong-un is walking into China with an incredible amount of confidence when it comes to his standing in the neighborhood and even in the international community. Russia's desperation for military support has provided an opportunity for North Korea to provide the Russians with ammunition and troops, and in exchange, an incredible amount of economic and potentially military support from the Russians, that then in turn has given the North Koreans and Kim Jong-un a very strong hand when trying to manage their other large neighbor in Beijing. And so I think you do see a lot of confidence from the North Korean government right now, and I think you'll see that on display at the parade in ways that could create real complications for the U.S. and its allies.
Potentially a pivotal week with all of these leaders in attendance in China. Henrietta, great to get your insights. Thanks so much. Henrietta Levin is Senior Fellow at CSIS. We'll have more ahead on the Asia trade This is Bloomberg.
Here are some of the latest corporate headlines that we're tracking. We'll be watching China's EV giant BYD when it starts trading later. The firm posted a surprise drop in quarterly profit amid fierce price competition in China. Net income fell 30% last quarter, missing estimates, with margins shrinking to the weakest since 2023. The car maker sold 2.1 million vehicles in the first half, just shy of 40% of its annual target. The Trump administration is tightening chip export rules for South Korea's Samsung and SK Hynix. Washington is revoking waivers for both firms to use U.S. technologies in their Chinese operations. The companies have been operating in China under regulations that allow them to import chip-making equipment without applying for a new license each time.
And Shery, that is the cross current that we are watching that seems to be playing out in the Japanese session. Take a look at these decliners. They are the biggest drags on the Nikkei, Disco, Advantage, SoftBank, Lazard as well. But there, of course, is another headwind when it comes to Japanese chip-related stocks, and that is in the form of Alibaba, because it does seem to be making some headway when it comes to AI accelerator chips, all about self-sufficiency when it comes to China here. We'll be watching Baba when it starts trading in Hong Kong in the next hour. In the meantime, let's bring in Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Analyst Catherine Lim. So, Kat, just looking at these numbers, Baba ex-Cloud China units, they miss, right? But they outperform JD and Meituan. Do you think this is going to hold in the second half?
Well, April, really, I think the expectations wasn't very high after we've heard from JD.com and Meituan itself. So it was a very nice beat, I would say. From Alibaba's perspective, the Taobao Tmall business, there's been a bit of resegmentation, but if you actually look at the CMR, the take rate does look like it's actually improving, which is a good thing as well. And of course, now that we've got quick commerce, which is all the food and on-demand delivery that's in there, it's a fairly new segment, I would say, with all the reclassification itself. But Alibaba definitely sound pretty confident that they were in a position to at least narrow, admittedly, losses that they are currently incurring for quick commerce right now in the very important October, November, December quarter. So let's see how they actually perform there.
Catherine, when it comes to really those metrics that you need to follow for delivery leadership, for example, what will be key in the battle between Meituan and Alibaba?
I think the most interesting thing that has actually panned out over the last 1 month or so really is that, Taobao is now looking to actually merge the memberships across its multiple platforms, and these are very accessible, very well-established apps, including Ele.me, Amapped, etc. But this is really going to actually drive loyalty among the Taobao and Alibaba's user, which effectively can increase order frequency, not just for food or on demand, but even the discretionary goods itself. And not forget that 88 VIP, these are paid members for Taobao. So I would say that, going forward, it is a battle of, how many of these members and how sticky each of these platforms or firms like JD.com, Meituan and Alibaba, they are able to actually hold on to these users.
So do you think Taobao is going to be able to hold on to the users with its new cross-platform loyalty program? Can that help to narrow some of the losses in quick commerce?
Yeah, from a non-food angle, April, we all know that we all shop on Taobao and Tmall, so it's a huge user base. So, this is something that I think that Alibaba definitely has the upper hand relative to Meituan and JD.com. They all have their strengths and weaknesses, but really from a scale basis itself, I have to give it to Alibaba at this point in time.
Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Analyst Catherine Lim there. Great to have you with us, in fact, because of Alibaba news, but especially when it comes to their AI accelerators. Those are some of the stocks related to artificial intelligence that we'll be watching at the opens in Hong Kong and mainland China. The likes of TSMC, for example, are key, especially after the news earlier that we mentioned about the U.S. revoking waivers for the likes of Samsung and SK Hynix to ship critical equipment to their chip operations in China as well. We'll also be watching BYD after shock profit drop, fierce price competition hitting the Chinese EV maker. We're just seconds away from the opens in China. That's it from the Asia trade. Our markets coverage continues as we look ahead to the start of trade in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. The China show is next. This is Bloomberg.